And you already heard the name, Kate Snaddon, that Tony mentioned earlier. She's going to cover a very important subject, which is the whole importance of wetlands. She's a wetlands expert. She's a trainee in Cape Town University. She chairs the Western Cape Wetlands Forum and is a member of the South African Wetlands Society. Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for the introduction. I'm actually not speaking about the critical importance of wetlands, but something that actually connects to what Tony was talking about this morning, and that is our legislation. Anton Kruger phoned me to ask me to speak about wetland legislation, and I said, well, I can't really because I'm an ecologist. But of course, the work that we do as ecologists is very much influenced by legislation. And so what I have done is just pull together some thoughts about what has really been lacking, not so much in the inputs, as Tony mentioned it, but in terms of the outputs from our legislation, the policies and the strategies. My title might sound a bit odd, Is Passion Enough? But it really is speaking to that connection of people and our intellectual property in South Africa, which is very strong, despite 30 years of almost chaos. Very strong, but the fact that our passion and our knowledge needs to interact with the legislation, because if we are to continue thinking that that legislation and those acts do matter, then we really need to interact with it. So there needs to be a combination of passion and knowledge and the legislation. So getting back to basics, and I'm sure a lot of you have seen talks that start in this way, but this is important. What is our definition of a wetland in South Africa? And it comes from the South African Water Act of 1998, and the definition is that it is land which is transitional between terrestrial and aquatic systems, where the water table is usually at or near the surface, or that is land periodically covered with shallow water, and that's quite important, and which land in normal circumstances supports or would support vegetation typically adapted to these conditions. And the key thing here really is the combination of terrestrial and aquatic, and that has meant that wetlands are in a strange position of kind of being between the two, or being a combination of both, or being one or the other. You get wetlands that are always wet, and then you get wetlands that are often very dry. And how do we manage those together, or how do we legislate for that, the fact that these are such variable systems? And also, in fact, in that definition, after some time, after 1998, it was realized that the pans, those big, largely dry systems up in the Northern Cape, actually don't fall in this definition because of the word and vegetation, because they don't support vegetation, they're largely dry. So there are problems in our legislation which I think intellectually we're starting to grapple with. It's taken us a while, but we're starting to grapple it and really understand what the shortages are. So as I said, due to the fact that wetlands are transitional, they're subject to a wide range of legislation. And I'm just going to run through, and this is a very boring, dry slide, because it's basically just the legislation that we have in this country. But just to show that it's coming at us from different levels. There's international legislation or policies that we are subject to. We were one of the first countries to sign the Ramsar Convention. In fact, we're considered to be one of the founding parties of the Convention on Wetlands of International Importance, and we have many Ramsar wetlands in the country. There's also other international bits of legislation or policies that are really important. It's the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Aichi targets, the UN Convention to combat desertification, very relevant to this country, a semi-arid country. There's Sustainable Development Goals, there's the IUCN and Red Listing, which deals more with species, World Heritage Sites. Then there's a whole range of national bits of legislation that are important to us as wetlanders. There's the Constitution, very important, and I'll just dwell on that a little bit just now. There's the National Environmental Management Act, or NEMA, which I think we often hear as an acronym and might not always understand what it is. The National Water Act, obviously very important. National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act as well, which is a more recent act. Conservation of Agricultural Resources Act, which is an interesting one because it actually predates a lot of these other bits of legislation and is really important for wetlands because it's actually about soil and vegetation. And the CARA Act is still very much with us now. And the Climate Change Bill, another more recent arrival to the party. I don't think it's an act quite yet, but I think it was accepted towards the end of last year, so I think it's coming soon as an actual act. Provincial and local legislation. In the Western Cape, we've got our own Western Cape Biodiversity Act, which talks about our institutions, you know, Cape Nature, etc. The Western Cape Provincial Spatial Development Framework, Biodiversity Spatial Plan, local SDFs, IDPs, EMFs, lots of acronyms, but those are basically kind of the outputs, as Tony was talking about. And we've got these inputs of very good principles, and then we've got outputs which are frameworks that actually talk about action plans to get things done. And then we have that whole body of legislation and policies and guidelines which relate to getting authorizations. So there's getting environmental authorizations through NEMA, and there's water use authorizations through the Water Act. And then also things such as biodiversity offsets. So a whole plethora of bits of legislation and policy documents that we have to deal with when we're thinking and talking about wetlands. But those are the words that we're starting to use and hear about this legislation, which might seem really strong, but it's fragmented. The bits of legislation that relate to wetland are scattered throughout these acts and policies. There's uncertainty about how to apply these bits of legislation, and sometimes they're contradictory as well. Remember that wetlands are this transition between being very wet to very dry. How do we deal with that? And also, in many cases, obviously there's non-enforcement. So there might be really good, strong bits of legislation, but the enforcement of the outcomes, we're really lacking in capacity. And not only are we lacking in the data and the logging of water levels, but we're lacking in the capacity to actually enforce the good legislation that we have. So we have a powerful set of principles. And just quickly looking at the really important ones, the Constitution, which talks about the fact that we as people have a right to an environment that is not harmful to our health or well-being. And also that we have the right to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations, etc., and preventing degradation. But it's very much about us and how we relate to those ecosystems. Then the National Environmental Management Act, out of which the environmental impact assessment regulations come, is all about sustainable development, where it requires the integration of social, economic, and environmental factors into planning and development. Very good principles. And then the National Water Act, which, as Tony was saying, is very much around public trusteeship of the nation's water resources, where if you read the bottom one, I'm not sure if you can see it, it's a bit fuzzy, but the national government, acting through the minister, has the power to regulate the use, flow, and control of all water in the Republic. So it was taking the rights of water away from people and giving it essentially to the nation. And then how that water is divided up speaks to the water use licensing, it speaks to classification and the national water strategy. So very good principles, and you would think that we would have come some distance in the last 30 years to protect wetlands. But what we do see, and this is the National Biodiversity Assessment, which was done in most recent times in 2019, we're still seeing the fact that wetlands and estuaries are amongst the most threatened ecosystems. They continue to be the most threatened ecosystems in the country, and also very poorly protected. The bottom graph talks about protection, where the grey, if you look at the wetland bar, the grey is not protected. So we have still, 30 years on, slightly less for some of our acts, we have good principles, but we're still losing a lot of our biodiversity and our ecosystems. And so there has been some adaptive management. There's been some realization that this is not working. And some time ago, Ramsar is a very strong proponent of countries developing national wetland policies. So actual policies that deal specifically with wetlands. It's not a requirement to be a signatory to Ramsar, but they strongly advise it. In fact, they have handbooks about how to develop national water policies. But South Africa over time, I don't think it was at a specific time, but it was kind of over time decided not to develop a standalone national wetland policy, but to incorporate the objective relating to wetland conservation and wise use into all the relevant sectoral policies, which basically is how we've ended up with this very fragmented legislation around wetlands. And those sectoral policies include environment, agriculture, biodiversity, and water. And the thought was that this mainstreaming of wetlands into those various sectors was considered to have a high potential to impact positively on wetlands. But in my mind, it feels a bit like grabbing a handful of darts and throwing it at the dartboard and hoping that it's going to hit the bullseye. So it's that scattered, fragmented approach. And over time, we've realized, and very recently, over the last 3 or 4 years, there has been this development of a national wetland management framework, which actually has a vision that doesn't just talk about what we can't do, so the authorizations, which activities can you not do, and what are your thresholds, and what triggers an environmental authorization, but actually bringing wetlands to the front and center and saying, this is our vision. Wetlands in South Africa are recognized, prioritized, and collaboratively governed as high-value ecosystems that provide multiple benefits vital to the well-being of all now and into the future. So it actually really talks about wetlands. And it has a mission, and it actually does have an action plan, you'll be glad to hear, to adaptively manage, protect, sustainably use, and restore wetlands. It actually, for the first time, brings restoration and rehabilitation in as an actual activity into our policies. Through the inclusive, integrated, and aligned national, provincial, and local actions that are supported by investments, bringing in the money, advocacy outreach, so also bringing in civil society, and science-based participatory research and learning, best available science. So it kind of brings it all together, which is fantastic. And out of this will come a national wetland policy, and it brings together the departments of water and sanitation, it brings environment, or forestry, fisheries and environment, and also agriculture and land reform. So it's actually bringing all those departments together into one room and bringing wetlands into the middle of the picture. So just to end off with, this is actually the onerous wetland, and basically the end message for me is that we don't want something like onerous wetland happening again, where we had a lot of energy, a lot of passion, a lot of thinking going into developing a very complex rehabilitation plan for the wetland. This is it's a drone photograph of the lower bit of the wetland, close to Camp Hill in the top there, looking at the burnt section, the grey section there. And we had ecologists, we had surveys, we had engineers, and it was a very complex plan that was put together. We found all the head cuts, all the orange dots there. We found the slumped banks, we mapped them, we had a plan. But unfortunately, due to a few factors, one of them actually being the legislation, which kind of tied us up in red tape, but also because of COVID, where the rehabilitation plan could not be implemented, and also ultimately a lack of funding, this plan was not put into place. And so going from a very complicated, probably quite a good plan, we've ended up with a continual erosion of those peat beds. I thought I'm not going to put a photograph of what it looks like now, because I think it's too early in the morning for everyone to burst into tears. And this is actually a 2020 photograph. It's a lot worse than that. But we don't want this happening again. We really want the scenario where good ideas, and this is a successful example of rehabilitation on the Agulhas floodplain, where we've got a plan that we can implement and it happens quickly. And I'm hoping that the National Wetland Policy will actually manage to speed those processes up, so these processes can actually happen more quickly. But also, that passion is really important. And we're finding more and more in this country, I think, that civil society is filling up the gap that government is leaving. And that is a really good thing, because civil society in this country is extremely strong and it's extremely well informed. So I think that's also a good thing, that we can bring in that advocacy of people and that passion to connect with our good legislation, our good principles, because those principles do matter, and bringing that together for good action for wetlands. Thank you. Short and sweet.